welcome to Questions at Midnight. I'm Jeremiah, and I'm glad you're joining me. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with a friend. It really helps more people discover the show. You can find Questions at Midnight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram. If you'd like to reach out with a question, topic suggestion, or feedback, email me at questionsatmidnightpodcast@gmail.com. Now let's get started. There are a few passages in the Bible that have generated as much discussion as Joshua chapter 10. A battle begins like any other, then the earth seems to change. Great stones fall from heaven, the sun stands still, the moon actually stops, Israel wins. For over 3,000 years, believers have asked one question: what actually happened? Was this simply a miracle beyond human understanding? Did God suspend the laws of nature? Did he use his creation in ways we have yet to understand? Or are there clues hidden throughout history pointing to something much larger? Tonight, we're going to examine one of the most controversial theories ever proposed, not because it's accepted by mainstream science, but because it attempts to explain one of Scripture's greatest miracles. We'll begin with the biblical account itself, then explore how Donald Patten, Stuart Harris, and many others interpret these events, compare their arguments with modern science, and ultimately return to what the Bible clearly teaches. So this whole ordeal takes place in the book of Joshua, chapter 10, and it's verses 1 through 15. But before talking about Mars and astronomy and what we're ultimately going to get into here, we need to really understand what's going on in the story itself. So we've got a battlefield. Joshua has already crossed over the Jordan River. Jericho has fallen, so the walls came down. Ai has fallen. The people of Gibeon have made peace with Israel through deception. So Joshua honors the covenant anyway, which infuriates the surrounding Amorite kings. And there are 5 of them. We have Adonai-Zedek, Hoham, Piram, Japhiah, and Debir. And these cities formed one military alliance against, of course, Israel. Not Egypt or Babylon, of course. So why Gibeon? And Gibeon wasn't a very small place. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 2, it says it was a great city, actually larger than Ai. So it occupied high ground. It had major roads, or it controlled major roads, I should say. And if Israel retained them, southern Canaan would become vulnerable. So this group attacks first. So Joshua has this march that takes place at night. He's camped at Gilgal, which is about 20 miles or about 32 kilometers or so from Gibeon. And it's about 3,000 feet in elevation, that area is. So you got thousands of soldiers. Picture this. You got thousands of soldiers about, 3,000 feet up in elevation, weapons, armor, food. They've got everything they need, but there are no roads, no flashlights. So they march through this rough hill country all at night. And of course, when they get there, they're all tired. And yet he seemingly attacks immediately. So why? Well, because Joshua and God were really close and they had discussion quite often. And Joshua 10:8 says that God tells Joshua, "Do not fear them. I have given them into your hands," or basically, they've already lost. So if you notice something, God gives the promise before the battle even begins. He already knows what's going to happen. So Joshua just basically says, "Okay, I'll trust you," and acts in faith. And so now, when did this happen is the question. Now that we know kind of where the battle takes place and what's going on, there's one view that the battle takes place early on in around 1400 BC to somewhere in the mid 1400s, around 1450, because of what 1 Kings 6:1 says. And that says, in the 480th year, the Israelites came out of Egypt. Solomon began to build the temple. So Solomon's 4th year of reigning was commonly dated to be about 966 BC. And if you add about 480 years, places this around 446 BC. So if you subtract the 40 years of wilderness wandering, Joshua actually enters Canaan around 1400 BC or 1406, some agree on. So supporters include, of course, many evangelical scholars because they view the biblical chronology as intended to be read literally, and that's fine. So we've got another view, though. It's a later date. So some scholars place the conquest around 1250 to 1230 BC, and that's because this mentions Ramses of Exodus 1. And there's archaeological evidence with layers of destruction evident in the area. And of course, there's different interpretations of Egyptian chronology. So many in this camp understand the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1 as a stylized or theological number rather than a strict chronological number. So does it really matter? Well, here's something important. Whether Joshua fought in 1406 BC or 1250 BC, the message itself doesn't change. Every Christian position agrees that Joshua existed, that Israel conquered Canaan, that God, of course, intervened somehow, and Joshua 10 records a miraculous event of this happening. So basically, the only disagreement here is what date. And of course, based on, we know how many calendars we have in history, and there's a ton. So which calendar, and then you gotta account for leap years and so forth like that. So, and how many days are in a year based on which calendar, and so it just gets very complicated when you're trying to find chronology. Although it is possible, it just takes a lot of homework. So, but the disagreement isn't about anything except that the fact that this event happened is widely accepted. So now we're going to move to Joshua 10:10, which is God, of course, fighting for Israel, not the Israelites, but God. So it says Joshua 10:10 that the Lord threw them into confusion, and of course he does this a lot throughout Scripture, where the fighters on one army will fight each other. And of course, what we notice here is they're all watching this, and of course, Joshua doesn't say, "I did this," I'm, look how great I am. Joshua doesn't praise himself, and no one praises Joshua, and Israel itself isn't praised, and God receives the credit, and that's ultimately the lesson we need to learn from this. And of course, we're going to move into the fascinating stuff regarding the events that transpired and how they transpired, possibly. But the battle immediately turns, of course, and the Amorites flee. Israel pursues, and then, of course, this is where it gets really interesting. And we've got Joshua 10:11 talking about these massive stones falling from the sky, falling from heaven, is what it says. And of course, we know from Scripture that the word heaven actually refers to the sky. Sometimes it refers to the unseen realm. In this case, we're talking about the sky. Rocks are falling out of the sky. So I'm from Oklahoma, and so hailstones falling out of the sky is nothing new, but these hailstones are much bigger, and they're not ice, they're rock. So it says in Joshua 10:11 that the Lord threw down large hailstones from heaven. The Hebrew language translates this as great stones or hailstones, depending. So it just depends on your interpretation of the word itself. But of course, why are the stones, of course, emphasized? Well, the Hebrew terminology allows for large hailstones as the primary sense. And of course, throughout church history, commentators typically understand these as extraordinary large stones or a large storm of stones sent from God from heaven. So there's a man named Donald Patten who talks about this quite a lot in his book, and this is where he basically comes in. He starts talking about the stones, and he says that something more dramatic may have actually happened. That this might have been an astronomical event, not just rocks falling out of the sky from somewhere. And based on what he's proposing, there were there was a lot more that happened, such as atmospheric disturbances, a lot of electrical activity, and of course falling debris. And he proposed that Joshua could have been witnessing a divinely timed celestial catastrophe, as it's probably best put, based on certain celestial conditions and other interesting theories. This basically becomes a well timed, or perfectly timed, I should say, event. But the Lord never says these things happen, but that doesn't, I mean, there's a lot of things that the scripture doesn't say or mention, but we know that those things happen. So I realize the verse just says that the Lord threw down great stones. And you might say, well, he's reading a lot into that. But just hear me out here. And again, it's not my theory, but it's pretty fascinating to hear some of these people's ideas because they do fit history, they do fit science, and maybe this is the way. I'm not trying to explain away, of course, that God didn't do this or that science did this or natural processes did this. But what I'm ultimately getting at is that God orchestrates everything perfectly using these methods. And this is possibly just one of those examples. I will always attribute these events to God, regardless of the mechanism he used to accomplish them. One thing I want to point out is that Joshua 10:11 says there were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. So that's a lot. And that is the interesting thing is that Israel's greatest weapon here wasn't them, it wasn't Israel, it was God himself. So whether these were hailstones that God just materialized out of nothing and sent to earth or sent out of the heavens, or whether these, as Patten suggests here, we're going to talk in more detail, that this was part of a broader natural event directed by God. It doesn't matter either way. We're just looking at the mechanism that was used or the events that possibly happened. Either way, the Lord fought for Israel, and the theological point remains exactly the same. So I want to talk about the sun standing still now. This is what is perhaps the most famous part of this story is that the sun stands still. But of course, we know in astronomy that the sun doesn't move, the earth moves, and we have the appearance of the sun standing still. But what it says here is that sun stands still over Gibeon, because Joshua actually says this. Sun stands still over Gibeon and moon over the valley of Aijalon. So why mention both? Well, because that is how you orient yourself to what time of the day it is, where you are. And Gibeon actually lay generally east or northeast of his position, of Joshua's position. And of course, the valley that he mentions here for the moon lays to the west. And so Joshua is describing the heavenly bodies as we observe from the battlefield itself. So the word in to stand still in the Hebrew comes from damam, and it can mean several things: to stop, to be quiet or be silent, or to be still, or again to cease. So or to stop. So that word itself produces a large amount of discussion. So that raises a lot of questions. So we know, of course, that the Earth rotates on its axis, and that gives us the illusion that the sun actually moves through the sky. But what we know is that the sun doesn't move. I mean, it moves through the galaxy, but that's another issue. But the question is raised: is did the Earth actually stop rotating? Because for the sun to stop, it would have to stop rotating, or again, God could just make it look like the sun stopped. But either way, we do know that God is more subtle in some of his when he directly interacts with humanity, in that he uses what we might call nature to perform to work out his miracles. And sometimes he just completely is supernatural with his works. But in this case, we're just gonna look at maybe and consider the idea that maybe this seemed natural, but of course wasn't. It was supernatural. So back to the questions here. So did the Earth stop rotating, or did the motion of the sun cease, or the apparent motion of the sun? Was daylight extended by some other miraculous means? Because if the sun stops in the sky, that's going to change time as we know it, at least to that day. Christians have answered these questions very differently, but all do agree that God answered the prayers of Joshua. So no matter how it happened, the end result is that God did something. So we're not arguing that. We're just talking about the in between here. So before we dive into his theory, let's talk a little bit more about the man Donald Patten. He was a minister, a biblical researcher, and a creationist. So, what's that mean? Well, he was a Christian, he was a pastor, he researched the Bible, he dug the scriptures, and a creationist, which means he believed that God created the heavens and the earth using direct creation methods only God could do, 6 days, creation, and so forth. And God spoke everything into existence, not billions of years of natural processes coming together to form things. Now, we're about to talk about an event that involves natural processes, but that doesn't mean we're taking the route of applying that to, of course, everything, because there are many reasons why the idea that natural processes created everything do not fit with the scriptural narrative. And we could get into that another time, but for now, we're just going to discuss Joshua's long day. So, unlike Velikovsky, who's a man that also had a similar theory, which we'll talk about in a little bit, Patten fully accepted the authority of Scripture from the outset. He didn't say, well, things like, "Did the Bible invent this story?" He more or less said something like, "What if Joshua recorded an actual event, an astronomical event that God sovereignly used?" So Patten actually believed Scripture and that it described real history. And the more you dig into it, I personally believe that's the case as well. And the more archaeology discovers, the more tends to confirm that idea. So Patten attempted to build an astronomical model that, in his view, fit the biblical record. So, and it took him several decades, but he did publish several works, including The Long Day of Joshua and 6 other catastrophes, Catastrophism in the Old Testament, and the Biblical Flood and the Ice Epoch. So Patten actually argued many major events of the Old Testament could be understood easily within a catastrophic framework that involved close planetary encounters. And that's what's going to be really interesting, talking about how, yes, what I said is that planets actually made close encounters with each other in the past. His work actually later influenced researchers like Stuart Harris, which we'll also discuss soon. And he sought to actually refine the chronology and correlate biblical events with proposed astronomical cycles. So all of this stuff works together really well. It's pretty interesting. Now we're going to dive into the Mars hypothesis. So before Patten, there was, we mentioned him earlier, Velikovsky. His name was Immanuel Velikovsky. He published a book in 1950 called Worlds in Collision, and he argued that humanity had preserved memories of catastrophic planetary encounters in varying ways, such as legends, sacred texts, and even myths. However, Velikovsky's primary focus was the planet Venus. And again, not everyone's right about some of these things, and he might have been right, but it looks like Venus probably wasn't a good candidate for some of these. But again, these are hypotheses and very fascinating. We'll talk about them. But Patten believed that Mars actually fit the evidence better. So why, do you ask? Well, there's a few things interesting about the planet Mars. According to Patten, Mars is historically associated with war. And that's always been the case for me when I first got into astronomy. I remember the first thing I learned about Mars is, first of all, it's red, and it's uh, named Mars after the god of war. And I never asked any questions after that. Well, Patton's going to bring that up in a very interesting way when we get into it. But another one is that Mars already crosses Earth's orbital neighborhood. So it does come very close, or not as close as we're going to discuss, but it does come relatively close to Earth in its orbital cycle when Earth and Mars typically line up. He also said that ancient records frequently emphasize a red celestial object in the sky. Now, if you ever see Mars in the sky, it's very small. I mean, most people think it's a star, a red star, and it is a little red. But it's a planet, of course, and it does show up as red. Now, there are stars out there that are also red. So, why would history emphasize a red celestial object over several when there are several out there? So, we're going to talk about why, and maybe that Mars made a much closer approach than it used to, and it got much larger in the sky than just simply seeing a red tiny dot. So, and of course, another item that Patten always discussed is that Joshua's battle is itself a war narrative. So Patten actually believed that Mars and not Venus, which of course Velikovsky discussed, best explained these observations. Again, this was all hypothesis. We're just talking about ideas that float around out there that tend to, some fit closer to historical events than others. So moving on, let's discuss some ideas about how the solar system was structured possibly in the past. Of course, this is according to Patent, and it's pretty interesting. I leave it open to discussion. I'm not saying, hey, this is what I believe. I think it's pretty fascinating. I don't have an answer for all of these things, but they are pretty fascinating. So Patten suggested that during biblical history, that the inner solar system as we know it now had not yet settled into what we know now as the present model of the solar system, which you have the sun in the middle, you have the planet Mercury orbiting very close to the sun, you next have the planet Venus, which is about the size of Earth, and is also further away from Mercury, but closer to the sun than Earth. Well, then you have us on Earth, and then beyond us, you have the planet Mars. Beyond that, you have the asteroid belt, which is just a huge collection of small rocky objects that basically take up their own orbit. Some have theorized that that was possibly another planet in the past, and that's possible. And then from there on, you have the gas giants, which of course includes Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and so forth. So in Patton's theory, he proposed that the inner solar system planets, the rocky planets, were quite different in their orbits. So according to his model, you had Earth, Mars, and Venus, and occasionally Mercury, and they experienced close encounters under God's sovereign control. And of course, these ceased when you have orbital patterns and you could call resonating orbits, which eventually settle out just like ripples in a pond. You have these planets that eventually settled out into their natural orbits. So they experienced close encounters, meaning they came really close together, and of course they stopped. Well, today's orbital motions, in his view, are the results of the planet of this orbits eventually stabilizing. So you've got these orbits that kind of wobble in and out of each other, come really close, and then eventually they stabilize due to entropy and so forth. So modern celestial mechanics does not support this, but this is what he suggested used to interpret events. Of course, you also have modern mechanics stemming from a very naturalistic view of the solar system and that it formed on its own through random processes. Okay, so now we want to talk about Stuart Harris and his views of this same interpretation by Patten. So Patten essentially lays the foundation, and Stuart Harris basically tries to extend it and supports it. He believes that the biblical record contains chronological markers that could be correlated with proposed astronomical events. And so his work sought to synchronize basically all of these things and basically help them to come together and support each other. So you got biblical history, you have Egyptian chronology, you have ancient calendars, which I think there's at least 12 ancient calendars. There's probably more, but historical records and so forth. And his goal was very ambitious, and because he wanted to take all of these things and essentially harmonize them together. So he hoped that if the planetary model were correct, that and the chronology of Scripture and the chronology of the ancient world would essentially reinforce and support one another. And of course, we have the calendar issue, which one of Harris's explorations is that one of the questions he raised rather was, why do ancient calendars differ, and why are they different? So, for example, some civilizations had 360-day years and some had 365-day years. And this is primarily due to the fact that when you're keeping a calendar, your main objective is to keep track of where the sun is in the sky, where the moon is in the sky, so you can know when about everything, and you can know when weather changes are going to happen, when the climates are going to change, when the winter's coming, when harvest season's coming, and so on and so forth. And that's why the sun and the moon were put in the sky initially on day 4, was for signs and seasons and so forth, by God, of course. So keeping track of that with a calendar becomes very complicated when you can't just say, well, every month's 30 days and there's 12 of them. In order to eventually match up with the sun and the moon and so forth, you have to sometimes add another month, sometimes add a day here and there. And that's why on our calendar today, there's some months that are 30 days, some are 31, some are 29, and so forth. So Harris himself wondered whether changes in the Earth's relationship to objects in the sky could have influenced how times were measured. And that's why we have all these different calendars. So most historians will actually explain these differences through just observational astronomy and cultural changes and differences rather than planetary catastrophes. But Harris saw them as possible clues worth investigating, so he looked into it more. So why the planet Mars? Well, Patten would ask listeners to imagine ancient observers, people back then before they knew what planets and so forth were. They would notice that stars would move a certain way and behave a certain way, but there were these other objects in the sky that looked like stars, sort of, but they didn't twinkle and they wandered. And that's what the word planet actually means, is wandering star, because they would actually move differently than the stars. And so sometimes they would brighten dramatically, and sometimes they would appear almost like a star itself, almost insignificant or almost, too far away to observe closely. And so, of course, every 2 years or so, it reaches what's called opposition, and which means it's closer to us and becomes much brighter than normal. So ancient observers actually knew this. You could go really far back and see that I feel like they were actually maybe even more aware of some of these things than we give them credit for. And they tracked them very carefully. They didn't even have telescopes until, I want to say, the 1500s or so, somewhere around there. And of course, you have the planet Mars, where it would be this red planet. And Mars, of course, is referred to as the god of war in Rome. In Greece, it's called Ares, which is representative of violence. In Babylon, the planet Mars was, I think it was called Nergal, and which means death, war, or even pestilence. And so there's this negative aspect to Mars, and I don't think it just had to do just with the color red. Now you could think, well, it's referring to blood, so of course, what causes blood? Well, war, violence, and so forth. So you can figure that out on your own if you'd like, but many ancient cultures also link this planet with conflict or even destructive powers. And so you kind of wonder why this tiny red dot in the sky that's almost difficult to even locate would be associated with such things. Well, mainstream historians generally attribute these associations to, of course, its striking red color and its strange movement across the sky as a planet. Well, of course, we know there's multiple planets in the sky that move essentially in the same way, but not in the same order. All planets and objects in the solar system move across an imaginary line through the sky called the ecliptic. And that would be the same line that essentially the sun and again the moon and all the planets move. And of course, the stars move differently. They move what we would say they quote unquote move around the imaginary point to the north of us called the North Pole, which is identified by the North Star, but the North Star is not at the actual North Pole. So, anyway, we can get into that later. But this was essentially the central point of his model, of Patton's model, that that Mars was essentially much more significant in the sky in the past than it is more recently. So we have several ancient testimonies that identify such, or that give us clues to this idea of Mars being so significant. We have stories about fire from heaven, of course, the flood stories, and you have the Epic of Gilgamesh. You have several Greek stories. We have stories about the sky darkening, the heavens trembling. And so Patten would argue that independent cultures repeatedly described cosmic upheaval. And of course, critics would respond that myths do not certainly point to a single historical event and can arise from shared literary themes, uh, common human experiences, natural disasters, or just cultural exchange. So, either way, it gets more interesting. So, Patton would go into this detail about Joshua 10. And of course, he points out that the sun stood still, the moon stood still, great stones fell, God fought for Israel. So Patton's question was, could these all belong to one huge event? Now, he doesn't say that Joshua talks about Mars or Venus or anything in the sky except for the stones. Instead, he argues that Mars could be an unseen physical agent behind the phenomena that Scripture attributes to God's sovereign action. Not that this replaces God in the action, but it's used as, again, an agent. So the distinction is very important. The Bible does describe what happens. Patten's just proposing a physical, what we would call a physical explanation, but that God is still involved. He's not saying that God wasn't involved. So let's talk about the model here. His reasonings work something like this. So, if God allowed a close planetary encounter, then one might expect um, unusual water tides, much more unusual than ones caused by the moon, huge earthquakes, atmospheric disturbances, meteor activity, changes in daylight, of course, and of course, trembling and fear among the nations. Anyone that would see, of course, the moon or the planet Mars coming up over the horizon would probably run in fear. At least I know I would. So he then compared these expectations with biblical passages and ancient traditions. And whether those comparisons are persuasive is precisely what the remainder of the episode will explore. So I want you to put yourselves in the feet of an ancient Israelite. Say you're walking outside one evening in ancient Canaan, and you spent your entire life under familiar stars. You know where the stars are. You know what time it is, basically, based on where the stars are in the sky. But tonight's going to be a little different. Something's changed. It's probably the year 1406 BC, and according to of course, that's according to Exodus, or about 1250. It doesn't really matter, but it's somewhere around those two time periods. There's no telescopes, there's no observatories, no satellites, no electricity, or at least no usable electricity by the human population. And every person knows much more intimately than most people know today where the stars in the sky are and how they move and how to navigate with them. So they rise and they fall in the same places. The moon, of course, does the same thing. It follows predictable phases. And of course, the wanderers, or the planets as we call them now, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc., all move in familiar and predictable ways. But then there's a change. So let's just say night after night, Mars tends to grow brighter. And then suddenly Mars is much more brighter than it used to be. No one's really, alarmed or anything, but because Mars has done this before. But let's just say it just keeps doing this. And one day it doesn't stop getting brighter. It just keeps getting brighter and brighter. So let's just say, imagine again, we're in this time period, and then priests start to pay attention, and people of, let's just say, social and educational, much higher social and educational standing start really paying attention that something weird's going on. Celestial events were actually recorded in Babylon before they were believed to have significance for kings and nations. So these things have been recorded for a long time. And let's just say that Egypt starts paying attention closely. And of course, all these different nations start paying attention to these weird events going on in the sky. And according to Patten, an unusually bright and steadily enlarging Mars would have attracted immediate attention because people watch the sky a lot closer than we watch it now. So they would say, why is that red star so bright? Or why is that wanderer getting so bright? And why does it seem to be getting bigger? And is this a new god? Some people, some non-believing or pagans, you could say, would, is this a new god? Or is this another god? Is this a god coming to judge us? Is this some sort of judgment coming? So again, let's just say it keeps getting larger and larger, and then eventually Mars is dominating the sky. If you can imagine, the planet Mars is bigger than the moon, and I mean it's not as big as Earth, but it's probably, let's just say it's easily in between the size of the moon and the size of the Earth. So Mars is getting much larger in the sky, and it begins to show a visible disk. So a sphere, or a circle, you could say, from two-dimensional view. So supporters would speculate that under such circumstances, people might even begin to distinguish lighter and darker regions on its surface. So you might even be able to see what we would call the surface features of the planet. So you might even see mountains, and one thing that's really common on Mars are dust storms, and they tend to cover the entire surface from time to time. So huge dust storms that would essentially cover certain areas of the surface and then uncover them. So you would have dark and light, different changing areas on the surface because of these storms. And you might even see the polar ice caps from time to time, which are, of course, very similar to Earth's in that they are icy areas on the north and south poles of the planet. And this is just speculation. We don't know really what Mars would look like as it got closer, but we can simulate it and think, try to visualize it in our minds. But you can imagine, let's just say this did happen, fear would start to spread. Is something going to fall on our planet? Is something going to attack us? You might picture the ancient kings consulting priests. Maybe they start sacrificing more. People would probably gather outside every evening to watch what's happening. And you might say that the heavens are no longer as stable as they used to be. So this begs the question now, bringing this back up, why is Mars known as the god of war? So Patent himself believed that this growing red object would explain why Mars became associated with war. People start panicking, people start getting scared, people start worrying about the gods in the sky and so forth. He argued that if humanity remembered a terrifying close approach, then later civilizations would naturally probably deify the planet responsible. Because you have Romans calling it Mars. You have Greeks calling it Ares. You have Babylonians calling it Nergal. And of course, these are all very negative words associated with death and violence. So, mainstream historians, of course, explain these associations primarily through its color and appearance, which to me personally, just seeing a red object in the sky, I'm not going to go, oh, that's a violent object. There's other red stars in the sky. Why aren't they referred to as? So just, I don't know. That just doesn't seem as likely to personally. Now, I might be wrong. I'm not afraid to say I might be wrong. And so, but this is what Patton believed, and that history would remember and document something much more dramatic. Okay, so let's say this is happening, and let's say that the Earth responds. How would it respond? Well, according to Patton, things become much more dramatic on Earth, physically, as far as the effects on the Earth from a planet coming this close to us. We know that the moon itself actually provides the tides on the Earth. So when the moon moves around us, its interaction with Earth cause things like the Earth or the tides rising and lowering. So when it gets closer, the gravity of the moon pulls the water a little closer, and when it moves away, they go down. So a planet, something much larger with its own magnetic field, would cause much more noticeable and catastrophic effects. So of course, stronger tides would be a definite effect, possibly more earthquakes. Volcanic activity could even increase, and much more intense atmospheric disturbances. So you might see all kinds of crazy lighting, illumination in the sky. Something maybe similar to the aurora borealis to the north, which are the northern lights, stuff like that. But maybe even something even more spectacular. We just don't know. So Patton argued that many ancient catastrophic traditions preserve memories of such events. So current science, of course, does not support this because in human history, this is just the model that explains the widespread stories of cosmic upheaval. So you've got two sides arguing, one that says no, one that says maybe. But I think you'll find it interesting that a lot of Patton's ideas and later Harris's ideas seem to actually, they seem to fit. And that was their idea, was trying to fit some of these biblical events with historical events. So possibly another effect would be increased lightning, increased electrical activity. So because you've got a huge body of rock out there orbiting, coming super close to Earth, would potentially cause enormous electrical interactions. And in effect, we would see glowing skies and just huge amounts of lightning. So just imagine the night no longer becomes completely dark. the horizon's always flickering. There's always lightning going on. Electrical storms just going from end to end of the planet, and it would be kind of frightening, I would say. And personally, if lightning went just nonstop, I would probably be a little concerned. So thunder echoing through the world continuously, if you can imagine that. And again, I'm not saying this happened. This is just the idea of what might happen when a planet comes that close to our planet. So they might simply write things like the heavens were on fire, stuff like that. So because they don't have the terms we have nowadays, where knowing what lightning is, they would just say the heavens were on fire, the skies were on fire. So, okay, so let's move to the day of Joshua's battle, assuming that the planet Mars is coming super close to Earth. You've got Joshua marching all night, about 20 miles, 3,000 feet uphill. So he reaches Gibeon, this area, and the army's surprised. The coalition army is surprised. The battle begins, and then, according to the Patten Harris reconstruction, the heavens themselves erupt in violence. Joshua records this as the Lord threw down great stones from heaven. And so Patten asked the question, could these stones have been associated with unusual celestial activity accompanying the proposed encounter? Scripture itself does not identify them as meteorites or planetary debris. The text simply attributes them to God's action, and that's fine. Whatever their nature, the remarkable point is the precision. Because what happens next is that, again, Joshua says that more died from the hailstones than the Israelites killed with the sword. So let's say to Patten that this demonstrates divine control over extraordinary natural forces. So that said, now let's do this from a natural perspective. You've got rocks in the sky that hover, that orbit through the solar system and sometimes hit Earth. Well, Patten would argue that every one of these rocks were placed in the solar system at a certain time by God to perform a certain action for his purpose, and that one day in history, these rocks would pass through the solar system, come close to Earth, and eventually land and actually survive the entry through the atmosphere to land specifically on the enemies of Israel. And to me, that's more fascinating than just saying, "Oh, that just happened naturally," and I think it's more fascinating than just saying that God just created rocks to land right then on them. I mean, that may have been what happened, but to me, I think it's way more. I just think it's a much cooler idea to think that God placed these things in the universe much earlier in history at creation for a specific purpose thousands of years later to actually land on a specific point in the universe on a specific planet in a specific patch of grass to destroy the enemies of Israel at that time. So anyway, that's what he's basically getting at, and it demonstrates God just sending a miraculous hailstorm, basically. But when you think about where these rocks came from, it's even more fascinating. Now, what does that have to do with Mars? Well, again, a planet coming that close to Earth is going to cause tremendous geological activity, including hailstorms and meteor storms and lightning and earthquakes. So, but what does that have to do with the long day, you ask? Well, let's see. Joshua then prays. It says, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon." And Patton believes that this is the moment that coincides with the peak of the catastrophe when Mars and Earth are so close that the most immense activity would have occurred at this point. And he proposed that the Earth's motion relative to the heavens could have been affected through this event. So you've got these two objects coming close together. Their their gravitational patterns and their magnetic fields interact in such a way that they essentially slow each other down for a little bit of time, and which would cause something like the moon, or sorry, the moon and the sun to essentially stop in the sky. So this is one of the most controversial aspects of this model. Most Christian scholars instead understand that the long day was just God stopping the sun and didn't require a close planetary encounter. Now, again, I'm not saying one or the other. Either way, God did it. Now, to me, I think it's a much cooler idea that the planet Mars would make a close pass by, causing so much in history to be affected by this through, well, this one day affected, of course, but then throughout history, Mars is feared by many different cultures. And you wonder why would people be afraid of this tiny little red dot in the sky unless it came really close to Earth and caused all kinds of trouble like this? So it doesn't matter either way, but I think it makes more sense that way anyway. But that's just my personal opinion. So Joshua obviously attributes the outcome to God, as does Patton, and as do I, and not to the planet Mars. Mars was just a tool in this whole event. So after the battle, according to this reconstruction by Patton and Harris, Mars slowly recedes and eventually equalizes into its own orbit. But weeks later, its brightness would fade, the earthquakes would stop, the skies would eventually calm down, and lightning would decrease. Life returns to normal, essentially. But of course, humanity never forgets that red planet coming so close and causing, you could say, war on Earth when an actual war was going on. And so um, parents would, of course, recount to their children what they witnessed. And then generations later, this memory would become mythology in some cultures and, you know, uh, legends elsewhere, sacred history in the land of Israel, of course. But as Patton argues, this explains why so many civilizations preserve stories of celestial upheaval. So, skip to today. We now have very clear images of Mars. We have sent several probes to the planet. We have satellites orbiting it, taking photos of it all the time, and we're able to take photos of it from Earth. I myself personally have taken a few photos of Mars. Not as good as the satellites that are orbiting it, of course, but I am able to see the polar ice caps and dark and light surface features. And I think one of my photos actually has the Valles Marineris, which is the huge canyon that we're going to talk about in a few minutes on the surface of Mars. But let's just say that if Mars did have a violent history of coming close to our planet periodically, shouldn't the planet have evidence on the surface? Well, Patton argued that it has very large volcanoes on the surface, and they're unusually large volcano. Actually, Mars has the largest volcano in the solar system, Olympus Mons, and it has. That's not the only one, of course, but it also has, again, huge canyons. The Valles Marineris is the biggest canyon in the solar system, and if you put it next to the Grand Canyon in Arizona, the Grand Canyon would easily fit inside of this canyon. So huge amounts of impact craters. And what's interesting about Mars is that the northern lowlands and the southern highlands have huge differences, and they are very contrasted between the two. You would think the entire surface would look exactly like the moon, where it's just completely covered in craters, but that's not the way Mars is. Planetary scientists do agree that Mars has undergone a huge amount of geological violence throughout its history, but they generally interpret this as just the result of billions and billions of years of craters, volcanoes, tectonic activity, erosion, not a close encounter with Earth. There is an argument about the craters on Mars, which is I find fascinating. And this claim goes that, and they are generally the proponents of a Mars catastrophe, is that the southern hemisphere has a huge amount of heavy cratering, reflecting a relatively brief, around 30 minutes period of time when it was actually bombarded by a huge amount of meteors when it came close to Earth. And because those craters are only on one side of it, and when you go to the other side, there's no craters. So the idea is that it came really close, and during that period of time, that all these events took place, and the height of the events in Joshua, that only a certain part of Mars was cratered very rapidly and in a very short period of time, about 30 minutes. So that's one idea. And from this, they speculate that many impacts occurred, again, over a very short time. So, and that would have been one hemisphere toward the source. Now, mainstream geology is going to give a different explanation, and that's that the southern highlands are significantly older and the northern lowlands were resurfaced by geological processes, and that crater density reflects difference in surface age rather than a single event. And so this illustrates a broader pattern throughout the discussion that okay, so now that we went over the hypothesis of what Harris and Patten proposed, we can talk about some of the scientific objections. And so, if these models are correct that Patten and Harris propose, scientists argue there should be some evidence, not just ancient writings, but in physics itself. So here's the first objection, and it has to do with what we call orbital mechanics, basically how planet orbiting works. So modern astronomy is able to predict the position of Mars many, many decades, even centuries ago, with advanced accuracy, at least where it was. And based on, and that of course assumes that everything operates then as it did now. So NASA sends spacecraft to Mars using these calculations all the time, or not all the time, but they have. And if Mars had experienced repeated close encounters only just a few thousand years ago, we should expect the planet's current motions to bear evidence of those disruptions. And they will tell you that there is no observational evidence requiring such an explanation. So, but supporters of the model would say, well, obviously the orbit stabilized after these close encounters, and now Mars is essentially stabilized in its own orbit, Earth is in its own orbit, and that's just the way it is now, but it wasn't that way then. Because again, modern astronomy does not assume that anything was different in the past, that it's always been this way, and ancient conditions aren't considered. Another objection is that the moon is in a very predictable orbit and very stable orbit, and that if the planet Mars had made a close flyby to Earth, it would have dramatically altered the moon's orbit. Well, again, modern measurements show the moon follows a very stable path, and Patten would suggest that everything obviously stabilized, and this is not the way it was then. So, mainstream science basically says, well, we see no evidence that anything like this ever occurred. Another objection are what's called ice cores. So, scientists have drilled deep into the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. Each annual snowfall forms an actual layer, a unique layer of ice. And these layers extend back very, very long time, thousands and thousands of years. And Antarctica, and in, I can't even say it, in Antarctica, even longer back. So researchers use these methods to study, of course, volcanic eruptions, climate, dust, natural events, stuff like that. So a recent global planetary catastrophe would likely leave a distinctive signal, and most researchers conclude that no such signal appears during these proposed timelines. Another objection is the rings you find in trees. So ancient bristlecone pines, European oaks, and other really old trees produce one growth ring per year, and these chronologies overlap one another for thousands of years. And scientists generally do not see evidence of a recent catastrophe proposed by Patten that would fit a Mars close pass by. Another objection is, of course, archaeology. And if civilization nearly collapsed from repeated planetary encounters, shouldn't archaeology show synchronized destruction everywhere? And instead, we see many localized disasters in the archaeological record, such as wars, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, and so forth, but not a universally recognized global catastrophe, except for things like the worldwide flood, but nothing really corresponding to Joshua's day. Supporters tend to encounter that catastrophic evidence may have been misdated, because of these differences in calendars or interpreted differently. So I want to talk about some of the strengths of the Patten-Harris model, though. And this is kind of interesting because even critics acknowledge that he raised serious questions and very interesting questions. For example, there are many ancient traditions of catastrophes throughout the world. Nearly every civilization preserves stories involving, of course, the flood, uh, huge fires, darkness, the heavens. There's even a long night, I believe, that was, I think it was in China. Now, I may be wrong, and if you want to correct me on that, you can. But it seems like around this time, you got the long day of Joshua. Well, you also have the long night, and I may be a little inaccurate there, but I have heard that there is a tradition of a long night. So pretty interesting. If there was a long day, there would also, I would think there'd be a long night as well. So anyway, there are many records of traditions preserving catastrophic events throughout history, and societies tend to preserve these events throughout their cultures, and they remain debated, but of course it's something we just can't prove. So one thing I want to talk about, though, is that the Bible does take miracles very seriously. So Joshua is not presented as a myth, it's presented as a historical event, just like the events in Exodus or Elijah or any of the Bible writers. Daniel, for instance, is a political figure, second in command to the entire world for many, many years during the exile. And his documents are considered political documents. He's actually not considered a prophet in the Jewish texts, he's considered a political figure. So these are not just mythological events, they are distinctively real history. And this is very important. So, Patten challenges readers not to dismiss difficult passages simply because they are miraculous. Whether or not one accepts his conclusions, his challenge does have interesting value. And I personally tend to lean more toward this model than just, oh, rocks fell from the sky. Now, God could do that. I'm not saying he couldn't, but I feel like this fits more interestingly and actually glorifies God even more. So there are some weaknesses to the model, and that there are some challenges to it. For example, Joshua never mentions Mars. Um, that could be there could be several reasons for that, but he doesn't mention it. The Bible never actually states that planets approached one another. The text never identifies the hailstones as being meteorites. So there are connections proposed by Patten, but they're not biblical claims. So that doesn't automatically make them wrong. It's just that there are issues. And but again, there's issues on both sides. So it does not mean we should distinguish between the biblical text and the proposed explanation of the biblical text. But it's just I just want to mention that there are issues with both ideas. Now, could God have used natural means? This may be the most important question of the entire issue. I want to go back to something that I always come back to in my mind, and that's the what you might call the divine selection on the battlefield. And this part always just seems to give me chills, and it's not how it happened or when or where, but really, well, I guess it is where, but where the stones fell. And so you've got Joshua's army pursuing the same route used by the fleeing Amorites, and yet the passage reports that the stones devastated Israel's enemies, and the more Amorites died because of the stones rather than sword. And so what blows my mind there, you could say, is that a purely uncontrolled meteor storm could not have just destroyed the enemies. It would have devastated, you know, all kinds of people on the battlefield, not just the enemy. And yet, from a Christian perspective, we have to consider that providence, when it comes to a seemingly random storm of hailstones, becomes central. And that, let's say, these mechanisms that were proposed by Patten were correct, the result could not be reduced to an accidental encounter. It would actually mean that God governed everything about this, and including everything in history, because you've got the exact time of the encounter, the battlefield location in the universe, the direction of the falling rocks, the survival of Joshua's forces, the daylight being extended, the defeat of these kings, the fulfillment of his promise, all because of a bunch of rocks that were just perfectly in a certain providential arrangement in our solar system. Every stone, cloud, movement of the earth, movement of these stones throughout the universe, throughout to the point of our solar system. Every soldier's point in space time, every second, everything about it just points to this crazy arrangement. I'll just use the word crazy because there's no good word for it, because everything is so providential in the way it was arranged, if this is something that happened because of the way God arranged it. And of course, we know it all happened because of the way God arranged it, but did he just make stones and throw them? Or did these stones originate from these events going on outside of our Earth, outside of our knowing of what's going on in the solar system at this time in history? Now, I couldn't go on this conversation without pointing out something extremely, interesting, fascinating, hilarious, all at the same time. It's that there's support for this whole model of Mars coming close to Earth through the most unlikely of sources, and that's through a fictional satirical book known as Gulliver's Travels. And before I'll give you a moment to stop laughing for a second, but I want to point this out that first of all, Mars has two moons that most people may not be aware of. They are very small, dark, very low reflective objects that one might argue are asteroids, because when you look at these moons, they don't look like our moon. They look like uh, little rocks. I mean, they look like obscure little asteroids that could have possibly been picked up through the asteroid belt, maybe, or somehow later, if that was a planet, who knows, or before, if that was a planet. Anyway, so Mars has two moons called Phobos and Deimos. Phobos means fear. The word Deimos means terror. You could say fear or panic or terror or dread. Either way, these are very negative terms. So, which again kind of backs up this whole idea anyway. But that said, let's talk about this book, Gulliver's Travels, which was published in 1726. And this book was actually a work of satire in these days. And if you know your history, you knew that already. But moving on, it's a children's book now. But the book actually describes astronomers on this place called Laputa, and they're bragging about the astronomers and how much they know, and they know about Mars having two moons. Well, what's interesting about that is that Mars didn't wasn't discovered as having two moons until about 50, 60 years later, whenever it was about I think it was 1877, so however many years later that is. But Patten considers this pretty fascinating because this is more than just a coincidence. So, how would there be a satirical writer knowing about the two moons of Mars, and 50, 60 years before it was actually discovered that Mars had two moons? Well, again, let's talk more about kind of the details of these moons. So the fact that Mars has two moons isn't the issue. It's how accurate you would say, Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, was with his, you could say, guessing. We don't really know where he got the information because, again, it wasn't discovered that it wasn't confirmed. I could say, or should say, that Mars even had these moons until 50, 60 years later. So what's interesting though is that Swift, the author, accurately stated that Mars had two moons, and he also stated that the inner moon, which is Phobos, took 10 hours to orbit, and that the outer moon, Deimos, took 21 and a half hours. Well, what's interesting is that the times are roughly a few hours off. So the actual times are 7.6 hours and 30 hours. 30.3 hours, I believe. So he was pretty close. I mean, for guessing, you could say. Again, he didn't know. He also stated that the moons were 3 and 5 Martian diameters away from the planet's center, and they are actually about 1.4 and 3.5. So again, not too accurate, but not too off as well. So, and there's people that say, well, he was just guessing because we knew that Jupiter had 4 moons, which it actually has about, I think, 69 or 70 moons. But we could see 4 moons on Jupiter. Earth has 1, so Mars must have 2 or 3. So he's just guessing. Or maybe Mars came really close to Earth and we were able to see those details, and he was just drawing upon some old legends or myths that have since been lost to modern literature. So whether or not he was guessing or had some information we've lost now, we don't know. But it's just an interesting idea that his fictional book about the moons of Mars was way more accurate than it should have been. And when Mars was later discovered to have 2 moons, these, the information just lined up really, really too well. And some will just say, well, it's just coincidence. But anyway, take that as you will. I find it fascinating as well. Some of this stuff just seems to line up too perfectly to be coincidence. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So, in closing, I want to focus on the miracle itself. Christians sometimes have a habit of assuming miracles must ignore nature and that they're supernatural. Now, they are caused supernaturally, but it seems that God usually uses nature in his miracles. For example, he used the flood, he used water. He could have just snapped his fingers and wiped out all life on earth except for those 8 people he saved in the ark, but he used water. And for example, in the Exodus, he caused the Israelites to escape the Egyptians by parting the Red Sea. He didn't have to use water for that either, but he did. And of course, Elijah, in the stories of Elijah, God sends fire. And Jesus's miracles are all over the world, or all over the place using nature. And for example, he turns water into wine. He could have just used wine or created wine. He multiplies the bread and the fish. He calms the storms. There are natural elements all under his authority that are used for his miracles. So even if Joshua involved natural processes directed by God, it still would be a miracle. And if God acted entirely apart from ordinary natural processes, it would still be a miracle. Either way, the source is the same and it's always God. It's just how it's executed. So, what does Joshua want us to see? Well, sometimes we become fascinated with the mechanisms, the how, the when, the physics behind it, the science, the astronomy, the geology, and so forth. But Joshua doesn't focus on those things. He wants us to know one thing, and that's that God keeps his promises and that God's there working all this in his own way. Joshua marched because God promised victory. Israel won because God fought for them. That is the theological message behind Joshua 10, not how it happened, but the fact that it happened. It's just interesting to talk about how it happened. So, my personal take is that this was some sort of event that could have possibly been caused by Mars having a strange orbit at one point, and then it eventually stabilized into what we see today. We couldn't observe orbits in those days. We didn't have the technology to look out into the heavens as good as we do now. But, I'm probably wrong. I usually am. My wife would agree. But, that's just the way, we got to imagine that, I personally find this work that these 2 guys did very fascinating. I appreciate that they take the Bible very seriously and they attempt to understand how it fits throughout history. And I also recognize that many of their conclusions are speculation. And, you have to really look at some of this with a skeptic's view at some point. And they might remain outside of the scientific mainstream, but I also realize that the scientific mainstream does not consider Scripture to be fact. And rather than just following the evidence, they tend to follow the evidence as long as it doesn't point at Scripture. And if you disagree with me on that, that's fine. Agree to disagree. So my final conclusion would be is that we imagine Joshua standing on that battlefield. Dust is filling the air, the enemy's fleeing, there's huge hailstones falling from heaven. The sun seems to stand still for a time. The day refuses to end. And then centuries later, people are still asking, what happened? How did this happen? And we may never fully get the answer until we ask maybe Jesus Christ himself one day. But Joshua himself tells us that what matters most is not, of course, the planet Mars, not orbital mechanics, not theories of catastrophes or astronomy, but what he says in Joshua chapter 10, verse 14. And it's that the Lord fought for Israel. And whether God suspended the ordinary workings of creation, or directed natural forces in extraordinary ways, or accomplished his purpose by means we have not yet imagined, the conclusion is still the same, that the Creator rules his creation, the heavens belong to him, the planets belong to him, and that history belongs to him. And just as Joshua trusted God on the longest day in history, we should trust him today. So, as I said earlier, the Lord fought for Israel. That's the whole point. The mechanism is fascinating. The miracle is greater. Okay, that was a lot. So I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the Bible's most intriguing mysteries. If tonight's episode challenged you to think more deeply, don't stop here. Please read the book of Joshua, chapter 10, for yourself and explore the ideas of Patten and Harris. Read the critiques. It's a lot of math and science and, really boring stuff for a lot of people, but it's pretty fascinating to go through. They don't just have ideas and throw them out there. They actually put their ideas on paper and actually do the math. So compare every claim with Scripture, of course, as you should with everything. As Christians, we don't need to fear honest investigation because the truth always stands the test. So until next time, keep asking those questions at midnight.